It's a great honor to be joined today by Dr. Roy Baumeister. He's one of the world's most influential social psychologists, known for his work on willpower, motivation, self-control, self-esteem, sexuality and sex differences, and social belongingness. Roy, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me on.
You're perhaps most known for your theory of the need to belong. Can we talk about that?
Sure. What what about it?
So
Um,
let's outline the theory. What is the need to belong?
all right. Need to belong is the idea that people have a deeply rooted motivation to form and maintain relationships. Um, so it sort of goes with this is one of the themes of my career. Psychology has long tended to think about people in isolation and that what happens inside them or what happens between them is a result of what the processes inside them. And well, there's certainly some validity to that, but I've tended to look at things the other way around, that what's inside there is there to serve interpersonal interactions. I think I started thinking this way back when I was in graduate school. Since then, the evolutionary influence in psychology has become substantial, and it seems to me the two biggest evolutionary innovations of the human mind are communication and cooperation. Those are both highly interpersonal events. Obviously, you communicate to share information with others, and you cooperate to work together for mutual benefit. Humans far exceed all other creatures in those two. So, when I came to try to get a grasp on human nature, I came to think the mind was shaped certainly by nature, by evolution, but for culture. That the uniquely human adaptations, the things that make us human, the essence of being human, are mostly adaptations to make culture possible. Again, communication and cooperation are two big aspects of culture. So there are many social animals who have an impulse to connect and be with others, but perhaps this goes farther in humans than others, given our heavy reliance on cooperation and communication. We 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 survive and reproduce by virtue of participating in culture. I was trying to think when I was writing that book, how often in my life have I ever gotten my own food directly from nature, which is pretty much what all the other great apes do every day. And well, I guess when I was like 8 years old, I went fishing and caught a fish, and my grandmother fried it up, and we had that for dinner. But that may be the only
Mhm.
time that I obtained my meal directly from nature, and even that wasn't fully from nature, because again, she cooked it on a stove, which is a product of culture. So
Mhm.
if I had to feed myself, I mean, I'm a professor. If I had to make my own shelter and make my own food and obtain it, I would have a rather sorry life. Probably be dead long ago. But I take part in this large system, which enables me to earn a salary where I can buy my food and pay for shelter. So the idea that people have a motivation to connect with others, this goes back far in psychology. Even Freud eventually mentioned it. His theory of anxiety, which is very central to his whole theory of human nature, focused on castration anxiety. The boy fears getting his penis cut off or whatever. But later in his career, he started even talking about separation anxiety. So when Mark Leary and I decided to pull this stuff together and see how extensive it wasn't like we were discovering a new motivation, but we were taking it something that was considered in the background, kind of a minor aspect, and trying to make it central. And we were both kind of overwhelmed and surprised when we started digging into the research literature, how much that is affected by this need to belong, that thinking processes are really geared toward that and attuned toward who is related to who. And what is the position in the social hierarchy, and so forth. Emotion very strongly connected with it. Most things that damage or threaten or break off relationships bring a variety of negative emotions, whether it's jealousy or anger or grief. And then positive emotions, likewise, come with forming relationships, that getting married, having a child, being accepted into a group, and so on. Having a child is interesting because the majority of studies have shown that parents are less happy than non-parents, and yet it's still treated as a very positive event to have a baby and introduce a new life into the world, and particularly introduce another member of your family to which you have relationships.
Right, less
So,
happy in the strict sense, but they report higher levels of meaning in the broader sense, right?
yes, that was something. It was another project I worked on, is how people find meaning in life, and I thought, well, having children it really is a major boost in meaningfulness. Which is not to say that people who don't have children can't have highly meaningful lives, and they often do, but the social connection to the children is a very strong automatic boost in meaningfulness. If you don't have children, you got to search a little harder, or do something else, which many people actually do.
All of this very quickly became textbook knowledge. So I was raised and taught psychology like within this sphere. So I still don't fully comprehend what it was like before then. But you mentioned that it used to be more individualistic of a field and people overlooked this importance of social belongingness.
Yes. Yeah, psychology tends to think one mind at a time, and so when I was in graduate school, which I'm dating myself, it was back in the 1970s. There's a lot of discussion of how self-esteem affects things, and your inner processes are there to support your self-esteem. And I said, well, uh, okay, maybe people care about self-esteem and what they think of themselves, but they probably care more about what other people think of them. So my dissertation studies and so on were focused on self-presentation, how people communicate about themselves to others, rather than self-esteem. And in those experiments, we would give people feedback. We'd have them take a personality test and um, give them usually made-up feedback, either publicly or privately. And it could be good or bad. The effects on self-esteem should be the same, right? Whether it's you're getting the same information about yourself. But the difference, when other people are aware of it, then it seems to have much more impact on subsequent actions. Indeed, when I was starting my teaching career and writing lectures on social psychology, I noticed these public-private differences were found in all sorts of things. People helped more when other people will know how helpful they were than the private donations. Aggression is more stimulated by a public expression of disrespect than some kind of private negative feedback. Attitude change from cognitive things over and over. So I wrote those up, and I was lucky enough to publish a review article on that, showing that again, the impact on your self-esteem should be the same regardless of whether anybody's looking and whether anyone else knows about it. But almost all the effects are much bigger in public situations than in private or confidential ones, suggesting that, what we care about is what other people think about us. And so that became a threat. And later, putting it in perspective with need to belong and so on, if we take an evolutionary analysis of this, well, what you think of yourself, it's hard to say that has a lot of direct effects on your survival and reproduction. You can think whatever you want about yourself, but it doesn't translate that easily into the material outcomes, again, for survival and reproduction. Whereas what other people think of you values enormously. I mean, reproduction, well, you have to find somebody who likes you well enough to sleep with you and have sex and reproduce, and after that, caring for the baby. So I'm not sure quite
So
what else to say about this. Yeah,
in
go ahead.
this evolutionary sense, self-esteem and social evaluation and belongingness are all very high-level conscious constructs. So you could say neurologically that's more cortical, but then I know that in humans and other animals, there are also subcortical, like subconscious tracking of status, and that relates to differences in anxiety and positive and negative affect that you were talking about. So one question here to disentangle the two is how much of it is really something like belongingness and receiving this overt social feedback versus something like just subconsciously tracking status, where you fall in the hierarchy, and then that influences something like your serotonin levels and baseline mood, and then that in turn influences how happy you are.
Okay, well, the concern with status goes back pretty far in evolution. That's not something that's new with humans, like conscious language and that sort of thing. So the concern with status, which is, some people are saying that's really different from belongingness. When Leary and I first wrote up our findings about the need to belong, we thought of status and power as a way of cementing your place in the group. The higher you rise in the group, the more strongly you belong, and the harder it is for others to kick you out. But recently, some very smart people have made the case that well, maybe there are two motives, and self-esteem could track both of them. It could track how your belongingness status as well as your position in the hierarchy. And in terms of conscious and unconscious, there's a long tradition of trying to say, is this one or the other? When I looked into that, it really seemed like almost all human behavior is a product of both. For one thing, conscious thoughts themselves are the product of unconscious processes. So you can't have conscious thoughts without unconscious processes. Communication, again, one of the basic human activities, requires conscious thoughts. The people who have really extended the realm of unconscious processes, like my friend John Barge, who's showed that a lot of things we thought required consciousness can be sort of accomplished with unconscious primes and so forth. But none of them have been shown that you can have a conversation unconsciously. It's very hard to talk about something while you're thinking about something else. So our thought is really one of the reasons for human conscious thought is this new kind of communicating with each other. The other great apes, they do have some communication. Linguists say it doesn't really qualify as a language. And the people who've studied them say, well, apes communicate mostly by gestures. The voice box isn't well enough developed, and it looks like early humans likewise communicated more with hand gestures. It took a while for the ability to talk to evolve, because it meant moving the voice box and doing a variety of other things. So communication probably started as hand gestures. Again, the key difference, though, between humans and others is humans do it to send information, and the apes do it mostly to influence the others. Richard Byrne, I remember he had a presentation saying he'd been observing ape communication for years, and there were only about a dozen messages that they use, and they're, again, never for sending information. They're mostly to influence the other. And I wrote to him and asked him for the list, and he said, okay, well, if you do it very scrupulously and carefully, we can get about 20 different messages that the apes use, but they're all follow me, climb on you, stop that,
Mhm.
you're annoying me. But the
So
stop
they're
that is there. Let's have
communicating
sex.
only for the sake of survival or status or procuring resources in some way, whereas humans will do
Yes,
it
well,
just for the
again,
sake of connection.
play was there too, but it was to tell the other what you wanted the other to do. So let's play.
Mhm.
There was play harder and play not so hard for again how rough the play is. But it's all to modify the behavior of the others.
Mhm.
My colleague at Queensland, Thomas Sudendorf, wrote a book called The Gap, which is the difference between humans and all other creatures. And um, he sort of zeroed in on two big things at the end. And one of them was that humans, unlike other animals, have this urge to share what we know, to share the contents of our minds. When we find out something, you often have the thing, oh, I got to tell somebody about this. It's the same with email has facilitated that, but you see a funny cartoon and you want to pass it on to others. And that seems to be pretty much completely absent in other creatures. I had a paper a couple of years ago thinking of the human self as an information agent, as someone who traffics in information. And this is what we
Mhm.
do all the time. Is I guess what we're doing right now. And it's very common, and again, largely absent in other species. So we had sort of 8 features of the information absent of the information agent. Only the first one, curiosity, seems to be common in other animals. Lots of animals want to find out information.
If you were to formalize that computationally, this seems to connect to information processing theories of consciousness, kind of like Carl Friston's active inference, where the idea is that what the brain is trying to do, or what consciousness is trying to do, is minimize entropy. And you could say that transmitting information free of cost through language or at very low cost, what it's doing is helping reduce entropy, whereas normally you'd have to like invest a whole bunch of energy to learn something and you learning the hard way essentially, and then humans are able to bypass that through language, and this is one of the things that allow us to stand apart from other animals.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that particular theory, and I don't quite get the entropy part. But yes, it's tremendously beneficial to the social group to share information. That oh, I found a tree that has a great ripe fruit, and so you tell others so they don't have to do all the search themselves. Or I found a place where there's water, but there are a whole bunch of snakes there. Again, yes, that information,
Mhm.
and others can use it to their benefit. So telling others that that's a big thing again that sets us apart from other animals. The next thing on the information agent was that you pass it along. So I don't have to tell everybody in the social group what I found. I can tell a few people, and they'll tell a few others, and that way it spreads through the group. Another thing is we criticize information. We're not just passive recipients. So again, unlike the other apes, we can bring up, well, I think this is a good idea or a good way to solve this. Somebody says, well, no, but that's inconsistent with other things, or it has problems. People debate and argue rather extensively. There's that paper 10 years ago that thinking is for reasoning. Kind of thinking is for arguing. That the biases people show in reasoning, like looking more for confirmation of your ideas than for a contrary evidence, confirmation bias. Well, that is a weakness if the purpose of the mind is just to achieve the truth by solitary reasoning. But if it's a strength, if you're trying to argue for your side, and other people can
Mhm.
argue for the contrary side, and at least the onlookers can see which is right and which is more plausible to them. So again, the group arrives at this shared understanding of the world, which is fundamental to culture. Um, and yes, tremendously efficient. It's lately I've been attending to how much these shared ideas are often wrong. But again, suggests that truth is not the only priority, that having a shared understanding is valuable and is desirable. And this, in a way, goes back to the classic Asch conformity experiments, where it looked like people thought they were one subject among half a dozen in the room, but the other five were actually all working with the experimenter, and they were all primed to give the wrong answer. And very often the real subject would go along and give the wrong answer rather than what he could plainly see was the correct one. But sharing information and achieving a shared understanding, that is highly valuable to us.
And you see the same natural selection type dynamics even at the idea landscape, connecting this to Richard Dawkins' idea of memes, for example. Some ideas undergo mutations that makes them more transmittable, and others just die out. And you see this especially at social media. Like certain ideas seem to be evolving towards more polarized forms, or forms that get emotional reactions out of people that make them more likely to spread.
Yes, the meme concept was an attempt to use evolutionary theory to understand meaning and language and communication. The drawback it's always had is that meanings are all tied into others. There's not a discrete thing as much. Nevertheless, the observation is correct, and certain ideas do get passed around. And we go back even to, before I was born, social psychology, the Allport and Postman talked about rumor transmission, and had studies of how rumors get modified as they pass along. And the modifications are all in ways that will make it easier or more effective to be something that's shared knowledge. So there's a trimming of excess details. There's a sharpening onto what are the key points. There's assimilation to what we already know and believe, and to shared knowledge. So new information does get refined, and in some ways gets distorted and twisted, but in ways that will make it more amenable to collective shared knowledge and shared reality. And you're right. The internet certainly intensified that process and offered new ways for it to come along more rapidly and more efficiently.
This social contagion is actually very similar to contagion of like actual viruses, right? You can model them using the same techniques.
You can certainly model them using the same techniques. I mean, the methods by which they spread are probably not quite the same, but contagion is how things spread through social groups, and so yes, we share illnesses with other members of the group, but we also share information, and there's all sorts of interesting stuff in that line. That I know Christakis's work on social groups, that people quit smoking in groups. That if you're a smoker in a group of people who smoke and you decide to quit, well, that kind of leaves you out, and that's a problem. But quitting smoking is more successful if, say, husband and wife decide to quit at the same time.
This is a great tie-in to your work on willpower and self-control.
Okay, well, yes, that's a capacity to change yourself, and that our theories have been rather solitary, focused on the single person. But again, having social support for it will help. And like I said, if you want to quit smoking, or eat a healthier diet, or become vegetarian or whatever, it's much more successful if your family is doing the same than if you're doing it and they're not.
So here's a hypothetical to disentangle the idea of status and security from something like social belongingness. So if you, Roy, decided to suddenly become a hermit, like your brain would still know that you're a high status individual, right? If you were to compare yourself to the general population at large, you've left an amazing legacy of research, and I'm sure you've saved up enough money over time. And even if you never left your home again, you could probably get groceries delivered, and you would have like all of your basic survival needs met. And yet, the prediction would be that if you had no social interaction, even if your basic needs were met, you would probably become depressed, or just your overall health would deteriorate, right?
Yes, yes. I haven't studied hermits specifically, but I know people who have looked into it, and they say there are actually very few genuine hermits. Um, I mean, Thoreau is sort of the iconic American who went out to live alone in the woods and so on. But I understand his wife and sister visited him every week to update him on the gossip from the town, and so to do his laundry, I guess. So he wasn't really isolated all that long. And scholars have told me that the famous religious hermits, there's nearly always someone who comes by periodically. They don't really live alone in the cave for 2 years and never see another human being.
So the cynic might say that in the past, what they had social interaction because they needed it for survival. Like you couldn't get your food or basic needs otherwise. But now, we'll have DoorDash, or like I said, you can get your groceries delivered, medicine
Right.
delivered. Like you could probably get by as long as you had enough money, not interacting with anyone. But again, that would probably be terrible for your mental health. And we sort of saw this during the COVID pandemic.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yes. The lockdown put a lot of stress on people. I remember reading early in the lockdown that both marriages and divorces were increasing.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
I can sort of see the divorces. So people maybe go stir crazy if you're home all the time and normally you're out working. What
Yes,
what
and
was it that drove the marriage increase?
well, I think people realized if they're going to live alone and just be alone all the time, that that's not satisfying, and so the lockdown said everybody stay home. So if you're having a troubled marriage, now you're together 24/7. That's going to bring out all the flaws in it. So that would explain the divorces. But if you're home alone and really don't have contact with other people, that loneliness could intensify as well. And so, if you I was relationship with so and so was going pretty well, rather than just be separate for all this time, why don't we get married and we'll be happier. We'll have each other, and be a cure for loneliness.
Is there sort of a natural selection type thing where a certain amount of the couples who had this increased stress of or forced time to spend together, and it reveals all their problems, so they get divorced, but then the remainder, would those then come out stronger?
The remaining relationships who survived, that's a complicated question. I have buddies who study marriage, and there's a lot that goes on there. I mean, it's plausible, but to say as a general pattern, being locked up together for it was really a year and a half. Will that strengthen the relationship if it doesn't damage it? I don't know. I'm not. I wouldn't be willing to make a bet on the result. It probably interacts with a lot of other factors that are going on, and some people may come out of the 2 years together uh, with the marriage intact, but not really as happy as it was. Others may learn to get along better.
Your work on sexuality, I guess you could break that down into two different types. So there could be something like intimacy in the romantic belongingness sense, like we were just talking about with marriage. And then there's sexuality more broadly. And this could include like sex drive and hookup culture and changes you see over time, whether with ages or across cultures. Which of your research focus more aligns with that?
Um,
or is it both or neither?
so I have published more on sexuality per se than on relationships, although I have
Hmm.
some papers on relationships. We had one just the other year that it was just a year or two ago that over the course of early part of marriage that the woman's sexual desire tends to decrease while the man stays the same. So there's a emerging mismatch. Usually when people get married, they're both having pretty high sexual desire for each other. Um,
If you're thinking about the stereotype would be something like men are horny and they're primarily motivated by a physical attractiveness, whereas the stereotype for women would be there's much stronger an intimacy component. And to the extent that's true, you would predict that sex would get better for women with marriage and as you grow closer
yes.
to your partner. But that's the opposite of what you find.
Right. Yes. Yeah. The backstory behind this is kind of interesting. I was in my office at Florida State some years ago and got a mail, a book sent by a woman in Australia, and she was a journalist who had couples keep diaries of their sex lives. She thought this would be a great bestseller. She called it the Sex Diaries. But one of the big themes was the men begging for sex and the wife saying no, no, no. Um, so she said it seems like some people go, like women in particular, something makes them go off sex once they settle into a committed relationship. And that actually had some evolutionary plausibility. If evolution has designed the female psyche, it has multiple jobs to do. Attracting a man into a relationship to be a provider, which is one of the key steps in human evolution, because none of the other apes, as far as I can tell, take fatherhood seriously at all.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have remarked on this and said, well, the human male is the most altruistic animal on the entire planet, as it's the only one who will work day in, day out for many years to provide resources to not only his children, but to the mother of those children. So if evolution wanted the female psyche to make that connection, the first thing is to get the man into the role, and sex is a big part of that. But then, once she has the babies, her priority turns to be to taking care of the babies. Um, and so, sex is not a high concern for her, whereas the human male, like most of the other apes, continues to have high desire for sex. I'm guessing
Mm-hmm.
that actually the human male sex drive is higher than that in the other apes. Um,
Really?
I would speculate that, but it's very hard to get data on that. I've talked to a couple experts, and they just don't know any way to test that. But for one thing, remember that one of my favorite lines about gender is from the great David Buss. Um, and he said, "Yeah, men and women complain about each other all the time, but they shouldn't, because the traits of the man and the woman were what uh, the other gender selected for in choosing mates in the past. So if men complain about women, well, the traits of the modern woman are in part shaped by what previous men chose to mate with, and vice versa, of course, too. And not just vice versa. I actually think women shaped men more than men shaped women, because women are choosier in terms of who they'll have sex with. So
Mm-hmm.
just the fact that they were more selective. And in terms of the high sex drive, well, that's what made it worth it for the man to enter into this provider role, where he's going to have to provide resources, basically doubling his workload. Right?
Uh-huh.
If your average gorilla takes, I don't know, 3 hours a day to forage to get food for himself, well, if he's now going to also forage for a wife and a couple kids, goes from 3 hours to 6 hours. That's a lot more work to do. And what makes it worth it? Well, having the regular sex partner is perhaps a key aspect of that. So women would have selected men who had the high sex drive. The man who said, I like sex, but it's not that big a deal, and it's certainly not worth doubling my workload every day. Okay, well, he took himself out of the gene pool.
Mhm.
So only the ones who really deeply cared. So anyway, this is speculation. I don't have
But
evidence. Very hard methodologically to compare sexual desire across different species. But this would be my speculation.
that does make a lot of sense to me, that men would be selected to have a higher sex drive merely because the ones who happen to are the ones who have more sex and are willing to invest more in it and leave their genes to pass on. But one prediction based on this theory, the theory being that women are highly motivated to use sex to find a stable provider, but then once you find that partner to provide for you, the motivation for sex tapers off, and then you devote all your energy towards raising children. That would seem to predict that the more unstable your relationship is, the more the woman would reintroduce sex to entice the man to stay. But
Right.
it you
Yes.
would
There's
but
that
I
argument.
think the data would be the opposite, which is that the healthiest marriages have the healthiest sex lives, and the unstable marriages are the ones where you see a lot of those sexual problems.
Yes, that could be. And you're right. It does make sense for the woman to continue to want sex enough to keep the man interested. We note the evolution of the laws, which are designed to protect the woman. So the woman's obligation to provide sex really kind of ends with the honeymoon, whereas the man's obligation to provide money lasts for years and often lasts past the end of the relationship, past they get divorced, their alimony and child support payments. Um, in terms of the decline of the female desire, we did this was my friends McNulty and Meltzer, were fine relationships researchers. They had big 5-year studies of married couples that contain this, because I asked them when I saw this journalist's book, is that true? Is that a pattern? And they said it's not known in the literature, but we could dig through our data and find it. Um, so it isn't as simple as the childbirth kills it. The pattern of the woman's declining sex drive, it was there even with couples that did not have children. It was a bigger effect once the woman had a child and they became parents, then her sex drive declined faster. But it was a significant decline, including among the childless women. So again, something about nature may have arranged for the female sex drive to increase right at around the time of mating and forming relationships.
This
Uh,
reminds me of a quote by John Deloney, who's a great counseling psychologist. He talks a lot about practical and relationship issues. And he says that in a marriage, doing chores, he's talking about the man doing chores, can be akin to foreplay for the woman. So this is something not completely non-sexual, but a wife might perceive it as, wow, my husband really cares about me. He's putting in effort. And then that can be a turn on, which indirectly leads to sex.
yeah, except I think there are several studies coming out a few years ago. I don't have the references on the top of my head, but that in couples where the husband does more of the housework, they have less sex.
Do you think that could be confounded by maybe the husband is doing more of the housework because like he's the reacher and the woman is the settler? And if you're in a relationship where you settle, then you feel as though you're settling, then you're just less sexually interested?
That could be. I don't know that they corrected for all these things as well. Yeah, it may be that he earns less money and so does more housework to compensate for it, and that is less of a turn on to her. So the finding was a surprise because a lot of people are saying what you said. This Deloney fellow says that doing housework turns on the woman as a form of foreplay, but it doesn't seem to work like that. And yes, and we don't have couples randomly assigned
Mm-hmm.
to do that, which is what you'd need for a really methodologically strong study and causal inference.
We've
Uh,
been talking very high level ultimate explanations from the evolutionary perspective. And to bring it down to a more proximate level, what are the actual neurobiological mechanisms that bring these about? I study hormones and brain development, specifically how sex hormones like testosterone influence risk and reward processing during puberty. And this parallels very nicely with the evolutionary theory that we've been talking about, especially sex differences. So, the theory says that due to differential reproductive strategies like eggs and childbirth are more costly for women, whereas sperm are relatively cheap. So it leads to more of a high risk, high reward strategy in males. And then testosterone seems to be the actual neuromodulator of this increased reward sensitivity and risk taking that leads to that behavioral difference.
Okay, that is very plausible. The neuro stuff and the brain stuff and the hormones is more outside my expertise. I've occasionally had co-authors who helped me fill in that, but I'm not such an expert on that. I understand it's true that in all species, pretty much, you should never say all species, but in the vast majority of species, the one who is more invested, for whom having a child is more burdensome, that's the one becomes choosier and pickier about sex partners and less willing to rush into things. So in humans, yes, the minimum investment to make a child for a man is about 5 minutes of very pleasurable activity, and for a woman, it's that plus 9 months of being incapacitated, and then a painful process of dangerous process of childbirth. Even if she gets rid of the child immediately after that, it's obviously way more than the man put into it. So yes, women are more selective, and all those other things you mentioned.
So we don't have to get into the hormones and the neuroscience of it, but to connect this to puberty, I know that at the high level, there are all sorts of theories as to why beginning at puberty, you start to see these sorts of sex differences, whether that's in impulsivity or in sex drive or in social evaluation, like the extent to which you are influenced by peer feedback, or women seem to be especially susceptible to like social comparison and anxiety and all sorts of things like this. And again, from the neuroscience and hormones perspective, you can tie this directly to hormonal changes during puberty that influence anxiety. But to talk about it from a very high level, are you familiar with any of the theory of why you would see these sorts of changes in social comparison, specifically beginning around adolescence?
The child development is another field that I'm not as familiar with. Yes, a whole bunch of sex and gender differences emerge around puberty. Understanding exactly why they emerge is I don't know quite what's been said about that. Adolescence has features common to the male and the female, and these theories actually, I think, have not changed much since Freud, in the assumption that the child has learned to manage its world, and then around puberty it gets these strong adult impulses and concerns. So it takes a while for the self-regulatory system to catch up
Right.
to that. The view of teenagers, I understand, as sort of vulnerable, high plasticity, shapeable, and perhaps prone to identity crisis and inner turmoil and so on. That's somewhat modern, but the view of teenagers as prone to get into trouble, that seems to be very common, goes far back in history, and is found in other cultures as well. So yeah, there are the new impulses, that the trouble part are there.
Right. And there's this motivational imbalance that emerges during brain development, because subcortical regions that are involved in motivation and reward signal mature earlier than prefrontal cortex regions
Right.
involved in top-down
Yeah,
inhibition.
that's the way of putting it. Yep. Freud said the superego wasn't took a while to develop. It's different, but it's the same
Ooh.
idea.
Yeah, I haven't connected those in my mind before, but yeah, superego does seem like inhibitory control, and id, you could say, is this earlier maturing, like
Right.
basic affect.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, that the basic affect starts there at puberty and ready to reproduce, and also for the boys to compete for status, including with fighting and all those things.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and it takes a while for the frontal parts, the inhibitory control, or what Freud called the superego, to catch up to manage it. And this, it's even like in the religious, the Puritans literature, they would have the I forget what was the term for it, but you were a bad boy
Uh-huh.
for some years, and you would smoke and drink and fight, and I don't know that they had much sex, but you would certainly do it if you could, and certainly masturbate. Um, and it wasn't until you had a religious awakening later on that you would pass through the dark night of the soul and become a God-fearing, respectable person again. But again, it took years for the front part of the brain to catch up with the back part.
Mhm. You mentioned that most of your research hasn't focused on development, but you are the mind behind the famous marshmallow test.
No, no, no.
No?
That was invented back in the 1960s when I was a little boy. Walter Mischel was the thinker who developed that.
Okay, did I,
Some
did
people might.
did you do research on this, or am I mistaken that there's a connection here to the marshmallow experiment in your own work?
I don't think I've ever done anything with that. We have some studies with university students on delay of gratification. We didn't use the
Mhm.
marshmallow test per se because when you're pretty much grown up, as the college students are, you don't. It isn't as hard to wait for the marshmallow. The marshmallow test really works for kids.
Right. Okay, that's my mistake then. So your research on self-control isn't about the development of self-control, but then that would be individual differences within adults.
Individual differences with state and trait differences. A lot of what we did was state differences. That willpower is a limited quantity, and after you've used some of it, you don't do as well with another demand for self control.
And what explains why some people are better at it than others, or why some people have more willpower reserve to use?
Okay, that's a complicated question. Uh, why some people are better at self-control than others. Okay, that's a fact, and we know that.
Hmm.
I mean, and most of us can look at their friends. Although, um, you being at Harvard, I imagine people there are pretty high on self-control, just to make it there in the first place. Um, but out in the world, yes, they vary. Now, the people who are good at self-control, we've come to think they don't really have more willpower, especially if it's tied into the body energy system of glucose and all that. They have the same amount, they just use it better.
Hmm.
Now, so what are the bases for differences in self-control? Most personality trait differences have a substantial genetic component. So yeah, some people have a head start with others, and it runs in families and so on. Um, the estimates tend to be about half of the variance in most personality traits is due to genes. And I have no basis for saying that self-control is different from that. It is something that we and others have shown you can improve in adulthood.
Hmm.
So the nurture part, even if the nature part is there, the nurture part is quite strong. Indeed, is kind of excited about that. Is the two traits psychology's found that really make your life better in every sphere they've been studied seem to be intelligence and self-control. and increasing intelligence is rather difficult. We've been trying for
Mm-hmm.
over a century, and there's, some people say, well, you can make a bit of progress, but mostly you're stuck with what nature gave you in intelligence. But self-control can be improved in adulthood by doing exercises and so on. We An interesting pair of findings is, we had this willpower depletion effect, ego depletion, that we found in many different studies and so on. So one question was, well, if once we have a trait measure to separate the people who are high or low in self-control. So there's the question then, who gets depleted faster? Whose self-control breaks down faster? Is it the people with high self-control because they have farther to fall? Or is it the people with low self-control because they're kind of already on the edge? And so when you deplete them by making them use their willpower on one thing, they'll quickly show these effects. Lots of studies in the laboratory and mine and others ended up finding no difference. Everybody gets depleted at about the same way. The only study that I know of that found a real big difference, and that was one of ours, was where we had people carry beepers around, or we actually used their phones, I think. So you experience sampling, you stop them at different points of the day. And so we had sort of a measure of, are you feeling depleted, that things are too much for you and you can't make up your mind about things. And on that, in daily life, people with low self-control had a lot more reports of being depleted. So
Mm-hmm.
in the lab, we find no difference. Out in the world, we find a big difference. What's the deal? Well, in the lab, everyone does the same task. And so
Mm-hmm.
they use about the same amount of self-control and deplete the same amount of willpower. So on the lab studies, yeah, there's no difference between high and low trait self-control people. Out in the world, though, low lives are different. People with bad self-control are constantly getting themselves into problems and difficulties that they have to deal with. So they don't pay their bills, and then the car gets repossessed, or the electricity gets shut off, or whatever. People with good self-control are nicer to their partners. They have less interpersonal conflict. And if you have bad self-control, you get mad and you say something that's really hurtful, and so that damages the relationship. So now not only do you have the problem you were fighting about, but you have an additional problem that you have to make up for. And if you end up sleeping on the couch, it turns out people with poor self-control don't get as good a sleep. The difference is bigger actually in quality than in quantity of sleep. But then that prevents your mind from recovering your willpower for the next day. What we learned is that people with good self-control, it's not the heroic act of resisting temptation, of not eating the piece of cake or sleeping with the wrong person, or getting too drunk and then driving home. It's not that so much as developing good habits. People with good self-control, who score high on trait self-control, they break bad habits and they form good habits, and then life runs pretty smoothly. So their daily life gets them where they want to be without all these problems that plague the low self-control person.
There's a bit of a paradox here because it takes a lot of willpower to develop good habits. So you feel
Yes.
like you might be drained. So like, let's say you work out in the morning and you would think that you're tired, your body's tired, so then you're going to be lazy through the rest of the day. But there are times where when I work out in the morning, I actually feel more motivated because like the day's off to a good start and you have momentum that you're able to keep going.
Yes. Yeah, it's good for you. Yeah, I did that for a while. As I get older, the workouts really tire me out, and so I really am tired. And working out in the morning is a is a problem for me now. But lots of people do that, and they say it's actually a pretty good thing to do because if you don't work out to the point of exhaustion, you just sort of get your blood, your heart pumping and all of that, and yeah, then you can go on and do well in the day. But yes, um, exercise in any case, it's good for you, and it's better to have habits of exercise. It's much easier to sustain. Starting an exercise program is difficult, but once I mean, I've been jogging and pretty much late in the afternoon for many years, and It's just a habit. It doesn't take willpower for me to go and exercise, because it's a habit. And again, that's what
Hmm.
people with good self-control do. Uh, we had a study, another one, where they carried the programmed phone around. It went off at random points during the day to look at desires. And so we measured if they're having a desire, are they resisting it? So we thought, okay, people with high self-control will resist more desires because that's what you do. But actually, no, they resisted fewer because they had life set up so that they weren't exposed to problem desires and temptations and things like that. Um, so again, if you use your self-control to organize your life, I mean, we all associate self-control with dieting. That's what people think of first. And okay, people with
Hmm.
good self-control are a little better at dieting and keeping the weight off and so on than people with poor self-control. But much bigger effects of self-control, of trait self-control on work and study habits. Those were the big things. People with good self-control get their work
Hmm.
done on time and are better at school. But those are things, it's not staying up all night, it's having good study habits so you don't have to stay all night, so that you get the work done on time and, start it when there's plenty of time to get it done.
Hmm. And perhaps we could close with a discussion on free will. So the pessimistic view would be something like self-control is genetically or neurologically determined by how well you were taught or the environment that you were brought up in. And then the optimistic view would be more free will, more opportunity to at any point turn your life around and improve your self-control.
Okay, free will. I'm actually in the middle of writing a book on free will, and self-control is a big part of that. The philosophical literature, they emphasize free will. The philosophical literature on free will emphasizes a lot of examples with self-control and with rational choice. And I think those are quite legitimate. That's what got me into the topic, because I had this research on self-control, on depleted willpower and so on. And then it turned out that also came from decision. So you have something that we now call decision fatigue, but it's the same kind of depleted energy for the self. And so we have studies showing that after you make a lot of decisions, your self-control is worse. And conversely, after you use self-control to do some lab self-control task, your decision-making tends to be more shallow and less careful and rational. So the rationality of your decision-making suffers. Yes, those are important part of any scientific theory of free will. And I forget the other part of your question. Oh,
But
optimistic or pessimistic? Well,
mhm,
yeah, you can improve. It does take self-control to do the exercises to improve your self-control. So there's a bit of a catch-22 there. But people do manage, and it does seem to work. We can refer back to where we started with interpersonal things. Interpersonal pressure does help people keep to their exercise plan. So if you want to have an exercise plan, uh, don't just privately resolve it. Tell all your friends you're going to do it and post how many steps you take online each day. So that makes sure that you can't skip a day,
uh-huh.
that you have to run the 2 miles or 3 miles or whatever you've set yourself as your daily quota. Um, but yes, self-control is also really useful for being a good member of society and being a good relationship partner and all these things.
Is the book on free will heading in an optimistic direction, as in we have enough free will to improve our lives?
Yes. I mean, I'm trying to develop a scientific theory, not get bogged down with the whole determinism debate and so on. But um, the human system for controlling action, everyone agrees, whether people, they say they believe in free will or not, everyone agrees the human system is really advanced. It's qualitatively different from what you see anywhere else in nature. So in a sense, they end up just arguing, is this it's a terminological dispute? Is this marvelous new system deserve to be called free will? And I think actually for me, the free part is less of a problem than the will part, because we don't
Mm,
really have a psychology of will. The will part is pretty metaphoric, like, having to do something against your will. But I would say it's fair to say that we have greater freedom than other animals. And um, to me, explaining this marvelous new power, how we got it and how it works and what it's designed for, that's the real scientific question, not some deterministic, not some terminological dispute about whether it qualifies as total freedom. And I don't even think we need total freedom. Most things in psychology are on a continuum.
mhm.
So all we have to say is that some actions are freer than others, and then understand what is the mental process that makes the freer ones possible.
That's a great place to close. Thank you very much for your time, Roy.
Okay, thanks for having me on, and well, we can stop there, but yeah, it'd be fun to hang out and talk more when I get there in probably, it looks like September.